Hi everyone, this is Dr. Scott, and this is week 2 of Rhetoric 6620, Writing Assessment Theory and Practice. This week we're thinking about theories of writing assessment. In week 1 we learned about different ways that folks have told histories of writing assessment in the field. This week I'm going to introduce you to just a handful of folks that have theorized writing assessment. They've thought about, in a more abstract way, what is this thing that we're doing when we're assessing student writing, and how are we thinking about it? To be sure, that also pertains to how we go about doing writing assessment, but they're trying to reconceptualize how we think about writing assessment. Again, it's very connected to the practice, and I think it's important that you think about some of these theories because you want to have assessment practices that align with your theories and your values and what your students needs. So these theories matter, and I'm putting them before practice. They go hand in hand, but I think it's just kind of neater to say this week is the theory week. Next couple weeks we'll be getting into assessment practices. So this week, theory. In terms of what we read in this class, this week might be a little bit more difficult. We're not reading high theory. This is not Pierre Bourdieu or Derrida or Foucault, although if you're interested in that stuff, I'm your huckleberry. I think that stuff is kind of fun to read, and I do think it has applications to assessment. But for this class, we're going to be reading things I think that are a little bit harder than some of the other things that we're going to read, particularly later in the term, that are talking about here's how you do a portfolio assessment. Here's how you do grade contracts. We're going to get into that. It's much more nuts and bolts. It's easier to ground it into actual things. But this week, there's going to be a bit less of that. We're going to talk about different kinds of assessment, but it's a little bit more abstract. The readings for week 2 are going to allude to ideas and events that you learned about in week 1. Scholars with ties closer to the field of psychometrics, the subdiscipline in psychology, they've really heavily influenced how we think about writing assessment. And I talked about this a little bit last week. And the readings this week, particularly Williamson, Hewitt, and Lynn, are going to hint at some of those histories and some of those connections to the field of psychometrics. Norbert Eliot, he was at the New Jersey Institute of Technology, wrote a history of writing assessment. He talks about major players in the field going way back to the 1900s, and he connects things back to the military and World War I, where the military at that time had to put people where they could do the best work, their best work. So they wanted to come up with instruments and tests that could evaluate what people know and how they learn and put them in a military job that was the best fit for them. And I talked about this a little bit last week, but when I was a kid, I took the ASVAB, which was the same battery that they used, I think, 40, 50 years ago, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, which then told me this is the military job that you are best suited for, or range of jobs that you're suited for. And then I chose 62 Bravo. That was going to be my military job. So that's how. So these histories are going to come back up this week. So if you're going to see a little bit of that, and in just a little bit, I'll go through each of the readings that we're doing this week and give you some tips on how you might approach them. So if the field of writing assessment, but if the field of psychometrics got its start in the military and being able to sort folks into different military jobs, it's also had a heavy influence in assessment, and particularly in educational testing. So organizations that create exams like the ACT, the SAT, the LSAT, the graduate record exam, the GRE, they've all relied on the field of psychometrics. When it comes to writing assessment, folks in psychometrics have had a really difficult time delivering instruments and testing scenarios that provide the two things that I talked a little bit about last week. Validity, does it measure what you want it to measure, and reliability. Is this consistent? Is this a test that, if we give it to 2 scores, they're going to rate it more or less the same? Or if somebody takes the exam twice, they're going to have more or less consistent scores because the different administrations of the tests are set up in a way that it's still kind of giving you a consistent understanding of what that person knows. So it's been really difficult for folks to in psychometrics to deliver those on those two criteria. When I was applying for graduate schools for doctoral programs, I think it was at Texas A&M, but I was very proud of my writing score. I think I got a 5.5 out of 6 or something like that, and I was pretty sure of myself. But I was talking to the grad program director at Texas A&M, and she mentioned the score. She's like, "Oh, honey, that don't really matter that much. It just tells us how many bathrooms you had in your house growing up," which is to say, this is a marker of socioeconomic class, and not necessarily writing ability. At least that's how folks in that program saw that at that time. So people that are in the field of psychometrics, they're trying to deliver a cost-effective way to measure writing. And folks in writing assessment, particularly those who actually teach, they're pushing back and saying there's not really a silver bullet here. This is not as easy as completing a multiple choice exam or having us complete something that, a writing sample that's going to be graded by AI. Testing companies will respond and they will push the use of algorithms, machine scoring, and folks in writing assessment have called into question the validity of those exams. And probably the best example I can think of is Les Perelman's Babel, basic automatic bullshit essay language generator, which would just spit out paragraphs of academic prose, and it was submitted officially, I think, for the ACT or the SAT, and it got a really high score, but it was absolutely nonsense. But if you search that, the Babel generator, Les Perelman, I think he was at MIT when he worked on that project. You can fool these things sometimes and get really good scores for things that mean absolutely nothing. What is the point of going back through this validity, reliability stuff? Why are we talking about these histories again? Alignment. And that's the theories that you're going to start reading this week. You're going to kind of get a sense of like, here are what folks that are doing this work that are in the field of composition and rhetoric. These are not psychometrics, psychometricians that you're going to be reading for this week. These are folks that are in the field, firmly in the field of composition studies. They're saying these are the theories and these are the values that we have for writing assessment. Therefore, if these are what we value and these are our ways of thinking about assessment, what are assessment practices that align with them? And they're going to talk about some of that this week, but we're going to dive into that much more in the following week. So that's why all this stuff is kind of related. Like the reliability and validity thing, those were values for folks that were in a very different discipline. And this week you're going to be reading about folks that have a different set of values for writing assessment. So, a little bit of help with the readings this week. Let's go through the 4. Let's start with Michael Williamson. His essay, The Worship of Efficiency, it begins with a short history of assessment and education reforms. And I think it's kind of nice that he has the two in there because you've read some histories of writing assessment, but he's getting in there now and talking about education reforms, particularly those of you that are in the K-12 world. I think this stuff is going to sound pretty familiar to you, but it's also an interesting take on it. So he really gets around to his theory of writing assessment in the last half of the chapter. So if the readings for week 1 made sense, if you've read people like Michael Apple and Henry Giroux and folks that have theorized and argued about the role of education in American society, you might skim to the second half of the Williamson piece to understand what his theory is. But I think the whole text is really good in terms of thinking about assessment, but also thinking about how assessment plays a role and kind of works into some of these fads that we see in education. You're really going to need to know about how he's talking about efficiency and what that means in terms of assessment. He also talks about something called the craft workshop model. You'll want to know something about that as well if you want to use that as one of the texts that you'll draw on for this week's discussion board activity. Brian Hewitt, super important writing assessment scholar. He provides a little context around writing assessment as well. He was also one of the co-authors for one of the histories that we read last week. He spends much of his article, it was an article in Triple C's, which is college composition and communication. It was also a book chapter in a book he wrote called Rearticulating Writing Assessment back in 2002. He's arguing for a new vision of writing assessment that maps onto terms like reliability and validity, but reframes those terms. So reliability and validity come to us from the testing industry. He's saying, let's reimagine what those terms might mean for us in the field of composition studies. He argues that his revised conception of writing assessment possesses, and this is a quote from him, a much clearer connection between the way writing is taught and the way it is evaluated. So let's not assess the way that folks in the testing industry want to assess. Let's assess in a way that's truer to what we're doing in our classrooms. In that chapter, in Hewitt's chapter from his book that y'all are going to read, you're going to want to know how is he rethinking reliability and validity. What are the values that he's seeing as being important for assessment? What does that maybe look like in a college composition context? So those are the things that you want to think about for his piece. Patty Lynn, also reading a book chapter from her book called Coming to Terms, she also points out that gap between how we teach and how we evaluate student writing. And she does that when she writes this on page 118 of that chapter that y'all will read. Composition studies has labored for the better part of a century with an explanatory scheme for writing assessment that has little to do with what we know about literate ability and that does not or cannot acknowledge the value of commonplace practices in the discipline. So what she's really calling out there is we have thought about assessment for years as in terms that are very foreign to what we're doing in the classroom. So if we're teaching recursive writing and thinking about writing as a process and thinking about doing creative and fun things in the classroom, but when it comes time to assess, all that gets put on the back burner, and we got to think about reliability, we got to think about validity, we got to think about testing and think about it in terms of testing. That for her it's too much, and she takes Hewitt to task for using reliability and validity as terms that he can reconceptualize and repackage as something that we can use for assessment. She says, let's get outside those terms altogether, not use reliability and validity. Let's argue, and she's arguing for two different terms that you'll come across in this book. And again, she departs from Hewitt, arguing that terms outside the field of assessment are just not going to work for us. So she argues that assessment should focus on being meaningful and ethical. Those are the two terms that she uses in replacement of reliability and validity. You'll want to know more detail about how she's using those two terms and what those two terms mean. The final text that you're going to encounter this week is Asao Inoe's appearance on Teaching in Higher Ed podcast with Bonnie Stahowiak. If you've never listened to Teaching in Higher Ed, it's an excellent podcast. It's just when things in education get really weird, and things are really weird right now, this is one of the sources I go to for a little bit of an uplift. Like, she is just really good at being very positive and giving very positive suggestions and doesn't sugarcoat stuff. But her episode with Asao Inoue is great because she introduces you to a really excellent scholar in the field of writing assessment, somebody who's pretty prolific and is really important right now in the field of writing assessment. And it gives you kind of a basic understanding of where he's coming from and some of his theories around writing assessment. And he talks specifically about labor-based grading contracts, which is a practice, but he also gets behind the theory of why that practice works. So I think it's a good bridge text between the theories that you're talking about and learning about this week and the practices that we're going to start getting into in the next several weeks. Of course, these texts are not nearly enough to give you a strong understanding of the theories of writing assessment that are out there. There are other readings that do a deeper dive if you want to learn a little bit more of validity and reliability and how folks have kind of critiqued those terms and asked us to rethink those terms. You'd want to look at folks like Pamela Moss, Roberta Camp. Those are good folks to know. Folks that are in the field of psychometrics, but they are, they're very critical of what that testing industry has done and saying, we're not going about this in the right way, particularly when it comes to writing assessment. There are also folks like Bob Broad, Ed White, Peter Elbow, Russell Durst, Peggy O'Neill, Linda Adler-Kasner, You're going to read a lot of these folks in the next several weeks. They also have their theories of writing assessment. But what you're getting this week is a curated example of different assessment theories. And you'll be introduced to more as we learn about different practices. What I hope that you're going to get out of these readings is to apply them. What I'm going to ask you to do this week is to, understand these theories and apply them to a writing assessment practice that we had at Shawnee State just a few years ago. Your task will be to write a letter expressing your opinion on that assessment practice and to show me that you have a working knowledge of some of the theories you encountered this week. So you have 4 readings this week. You have 3 readings in a podcast episode. I'm going to ask that you draw from at least 3 of those 4 texts. I'm looking for some depth of thought. So if you just say, hey, I think context is important because Brian Hewitt, I think, thinks context is important, that's not nearly enough. You need to get into the weeds a little bit and show me that you've understood what Brian Hewitt or Sawanoe or Patty Lynn, what these folks are, what they're really trying to argue, what's their theory behind assessment, and show me that you have a bit of depth of understanding about that. The readings this week are tough, so if you have any questions, make sure that you ask me over email, or you can use the Dr. Scott's AMA link. It's not just for talk about the Lakers and John Deere tractors. It's also for like, hey, I don't understand what's going on with this passage. Can you help me out? I'd be happy to chat with y'all about that stuff. I'm really looking forward to your readings and hearing your thoughts. That the discussion board activity this week, have fun with it. Imagine it's like writing a letter to like, I don't think this assessment practice is great. Or maybe you do think it's great. Maybe you draw upon some of the theories that you're going to read this week to say, I think it's awesome, or, hey, I think something's not working here. Have fun with it. Thanks a bunch for your time, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Bye for now.